Hey, everybody. Well, I want to take a few minutes today. We're going to be talking about wetland geochemical cycles, the second part of that lecture today. But before we get started on that, I want to take a few minutes and I want to talk about some other aspects of the professional environment. As seniors, I know a lot of you guys are graduating in the spring, and when you enter the professional environment, whether that is in public service, either in government or nonprofits, or whether you're working in the private sector. Um, there are expectations as professionals for scientists that can easily be overlooked unless you've had some training in those areas. And I think I'd like the opportunity to share some of my experience and some of the things that I think are valuable that may be valuable to you as you enter the workforce. So I'll touch on a couple of these over the course of the semester, but today I just wanted to touch a little bit on professionalism in the workforce. Um, there are expectations of me as a professional that have changed a little bit over time. It is something, being a professional is constantly learning and evolving and adapting to changes in the environment. But in general, professionalism in and of itself has some fairly static and but yet significant aspects that I'd like to touch on with you. So, professionalism, when you look up that term, you'll see things like, I took an example from Britannica here, the skill, good judgment, and polite behavior that is expected from a person who is trained to do a job well. Okay, that's good. Or conducting oneself with responsibility, integrity, accountability, and excellence, communicating effectively and appropriately. That's right from the Department of Labor. And that's all accurate. But I think probably one of my favorite definitions comes from Christopher Bramley, and he's got a two-part blog on LinkedIn that I put a link down here to the first part that you can take a look at, where he talks about this. And in here, he now hits bullet points: professionalism, focus, ethics, due process, proper conduct, empathy, collaboration, and so on, right? Um, these things are really critical and comprehensive in your dealings with other professionals in your field, other professionals in other fields, clients, anybody you might be interacting with, which might be more complex than it seems like at first. I know as a scientist over the course of my practice, I have worked with everybody from other seasoned, often more seasoned professionals than myself, to kids and adults that have no understanding of my practice area, clients that need something from me, regulators who also need something from me, and sometimes those things don't match. So being able to communicate with all of those people in a way that's respectful, that is consistent with my professional ethics as an environmental scientist, that is acknowledging the reality of the facts on the ground, that shows understanding, right? Those things are really important. Obviously, demonstrating your skill and knowledge in the area that you're tasked with working, that's the minimum. That's the bare minimum. These communication skills, whether that's in writing or verbally, are really important to being successful. They can be the difference between getting a job and not getting a job, getting a job and keeping it versus getting a job and losing it, having repeated clients, finding your way up the ladder as if you want to do so in your particular field. All of these things are really critical, and there's actually more to it than that. But so I would encourage you to take a look at this and read it. Um, why I'm bringing this up now, I wanted to insert this here is again, as you're getting to the point where you're starting to probably look at what you're going to do when you graduate from, with your degree, graduate from Anna and Galveston, what's this going to look like? Um, so, a couple things to note, again, from my experience. Number one, the sciences are very interdisciplinary. A lot of my work over these years has been working as part of a team. So I'm often working with professionals from other fields. Some of those are other scientists. So I can say in my consulting work, some of the projects I've done, especially Corps of Engineers kind of projects, have been on dams and levees. They've involved public safety. There are impacts to local economies. So I have worked with scientists like environmental geologists, other biologists, including fisheries biologists. I have worked with modelers. I've worked with GIS specialists. I have worked with economists, attorneys, and many others, right, over that, and oftentimes in a collaborative kind of format. Well, we all have different disciplinary training. In some cases, the language between different disciplines, the terminology can vary pretty significantly, and the expectations can differ a little bit. So when you approach that, you have to be open and flexible, and there has to be some negotiation in terms of establishing a professional basis for sharing information, data, all of that sort of thing. Also, you might have noticed that some of those fields aren't even in the sciences. Many of the attorneys that I work with have little or sometimes no background in the sciences of any significance. This is also true with clients in many instances when I've worked in the private sector. When I'm working in education, oftentimes my students, or when I'm doing outreach type of events, either through my volunteer work or through the work I did with the nonprofit, a lot of times I'm working with people who don't have that understanding. And in some cases, we're teaming up trying to accomplish some outcome, some positive outcome. So you have to recognize that and be prepared for that. And that means you also have to be respectful of what those fields are bringing to the table and the people that are engaged in them. Because again, the expectations can really vary from one field to the other. Um, in order to succeed, again, you have to master effective, respectful, and collaborative communication, and patience too, across these different disciplines and the different types of people that you'll run across. Another thing that I think is really important, and I want to emphasize at this point, and we are going to come back, I want to come back and touch base again on this a little bit later in the semester, has to do with ethics. So, the environmental fields, all of them, and I consider marine biology a part of that. Um, there's a lot of different communities, professional communities within these groups, and a lot of them actually have professional ethics as part of being a part of that society, right? That you are agreeing, if you're going to be part of the society, that you are um, subscribing to those particular ethics. So I have long been associated with the National Environmental Association of the National Association of Environmental Professionals, NAEP. And so we have a code of ethics. And if you want to link on it, I put a hot link here. You can pull up that URL and take a look. Um, you're going to find these again in a lot of different professional societies, and you may have some of your own, some things that you think are important lines that you need to, boundaries that you need to stay within. And I think that's important. In my work in private practice, those ethics are really important in determining if a job is right for me or I'm right for the job. I have turned down opportunities because they would have stretched my professional ethics in some area or another, and I wasn't comfortable doing that. And so that's something I think you need to consider. There are people that are going to try and get you to do things that you may not feel comfortable doing. certainly not things that are contrary to the law, but even some things that might try and skirt regulations or do something that isn't going to lead to an outcome. In the sciences, when you are trying to conduct an experiment or a study, you don't want to do anything in your research that is going to lead to a biased outcome that would then mislead people. Remembering that the purpose of science is to inform decision making, you don't want somebody making bad decisions because you did something that wasn't the right thing to do, right? And so those ethics can put a framework to that for you. So I'd encourage you to look at that, spend a little time with that between now and then. The reason I'm bringing this up now again is because your career really has already started. Whether you know it or not, you are already engaging with people that you might be working with over the entire course of your career. I still work with people that I was in my undergraduate and graduate level training with more than 30 years ago in some cases. And so that networking that you're doing should be starting now. The preparation that you have as you enter the workforce should be starting now. The college or university environment is really about being able to practice and make mistakes without quite the same consequences that you're going to have in the work environment. So the more you can get ahead of that, the better prepared you're going to be, the better experience you're going to have, the less setbacks you're going to have. So think about that. If I can offer any guidance or experience, you want to talk about it more in depth, I'm more than happy to do that. All you need to do is reach out to me. Okay. All right. So with that, let's dive now into wetland biogeochemistry. We're still in the same section we were on last class period, and the goals, again, are encompassing of these two lectures. So when we left class last time, we were talking about the carbon cycle. So that's one of those biogeochemical cycles. And again, all of this kind of subscribes to the law of conservation of matter. Matter cannot be created or destroyed. So matter is constantly cycled through the environment. This is true of these nutrients as well. Um, so I don't want to focus so much on the cycle part of it because this is stuff these cycles really you should have studied in your freshman, sophomore level biology courses. What I want to focus on with these is some of the highlights in terms of things that are problematic for us and where aquatic or wetland environments offer some sort of particular benefit or function within those cycles that you should know about as you're studying wetland plant ecology, right? Coastal plant ecology. So one of the things here with carbon is that carbon, we have really upset the balance of that cycle. And one of the big reasons that it's upset is because of combustion of fossil fuel resources. And if you step back and think about what those fossil fuels are, they are largely plants and some animals that have decomposed, and the energy and carbon has been pooled in things like oil and coal that are well secured in soils, like they're way underground. And carbon underground does not behave the same way it does as when it's in the atmosphere, right? So when we dig those up and we combust them, they get into the atmosphere when they're not really supposed to be in the atmosphere, right? The cycle has placed those underground in order to keep the balance of carbon at the appropriate level in homeostasis, right? In some stability. So plants work as part of this. You've got sinks that include the soils. There's sources also, but we've kind of made ourselves an extra source. So we're kind of external to the natural cycle, and that has led to an imbalance. And so much of these, as we talked about previously, much of these emissions are in the atmosphere, and they're causing significant problems because of the way they affect heat retention on the Earth, among other things. So we talked a little bit about whether or not plants can offset this. And, one of the really interesting things about coastal wetland environments is the plants, because they're adapted to the particular stressors, happen to be really good at sequestering carbon down into the soils. And so there's real value to that. So we talked a little bit about blue carbon. Carbon sequestration, utilizing plants in terms of carbon sequestration is not a new thing. I know we've talked about this in class about the rainforest, and there's been a lot of attention since I was your age about saving the rainforest, and that's a valuable endeavor to take on. So the rainforest provides unique habitats. It provides a lot of things beyond carbon sequestration. And as it turns out, in terms of carbon sequestration, it is not nearly as effective as these wetland environments are, right? So you'll remember we talked about this. And these wetlands, particularly mangroves and salt marsh, are really effective at getting carbon from the atmosphere down into the soils. So we looked at some of the facts of this on the ground. There's just a different way of looking at that same data. And we talked a little bit about how, in order to stimulate utilizing these ecosystem services that these wetlands provide, we talked about how there are markets, economic markets developing around this that would put money into developing wetland resources largely because they sequester carbon, and that could offset our emissions in other areas. Okay, so this catches us up to where we are. What I want to do now is I want to talk a little bit about why they're able to do this, why wetlands are particularly good at sequestering carbon. And so it really comes down to one particular feature. So if you look at this graphic here, you'll notice, so we're talking about, here's our atmospheric carbon, right? Our CO2 primarily. And wetlands are able to assimilate carbon. They do this in part through photosynthesis, right? There are soil microbes that also sequester carbon. So they're doing that, right? In these wetlands, like you would recognize these all over Galveston Island. If you go up I-45, all there along Virginia Point, right? They can also lose carbon as part of these, part of their biologic processes, right? So, we've talked about plants and how during photosynthesis, of course, they pull carbon dioxide out of the air. They strip the carbon off, breathe the oxygen back out, and then they utilize that carbon to build sugars in a two-step process that gets them to building biomass, right? And so that sequesters a lot of carbon. But during respiration, just like animals, they actually exhale carbon dioxide, right? So they're releasing carbon dioxide into the environment. So it's not all, plants aren't all about just taking in carbon dioxide. There is some lease, so they do lose, or loss rather. So they do lose a little bit here. Same thing, respiration with soil microbes and other organisms release carbon into the atmosphere. But another part of it has to do with decomposition. So plant material, or actually any biologic material, as it decomposes, some of the off gassing that occurs includes carbon in a number of different forms, and that can include carbon dioxide. So wetlands, this is an issue actually in the Arctic, in areas where with increasingly long and warm summers, the tundra is starting to melt. Normally, the tundra would stay frozen down under there, and so a lot of the bogs and plant communities that only would be unfrozen for a short period of time or unfrozen for much longer periods of time. And so they release volatile organic carbons over time. And that's a whole family suite of different types of chemicals. But volatilization means they're going up into the atmosphere. And in the atmosphere, that's where they cause harm. So the longer that occurs, the more that material breaks down. It's bacteria that are breaking those things down, and they're respiring carbon as part of that. And that can actually, across the amount of space that we're talking about, can be vast amounts of VOCs. So decomposition is an area that is definitely on the carbon loss side, right? And something we definitely need to be alert to. So The assimilation versus carbon loss, that balance is a big part of the equation that we've, again, messed up on the emission side from our fossil fuel burning. But with wetlands here, it's really kind of the same story. You have to look at the amount of assimilation versus the amount of loss. And generally, wetlands are considered to be what we refer to as carbon sinks. So sinks absorb things, okay? Sources release them. And on balance, wetlands tend to be better carbon sinks than sources, generally. Not always the case, and there are circumstances where that doesn't happen, but on average, okay? Part of that has to do here with the structure of wetlands relative to, say, tropical rainforest or many other types of terrestrial habitats. And if you'll notice here, so this is showing you root versus shoot biomass, so roots in brown, shoots in green. And what you see is that on average, our wetland plants tend to have a very high proportion of root biomass under the soil line, right? And those roots are really good at sequestering carbon into those soils. And there's a handful of different processes that accomplish that, but the bottom line is that they're very good at doing that. Whereas when you look at, again, here, tropical rainforest, they do sequester carbon, but a lot of that is above the soil line, right? So it's in the trunk of the trees, it's in the leaves of the trees, and so that is less permanent. There's more opportunity for that carbon to be re-released back into the atmosphere when it's in its above ground biomass component. And so getting that down into the soils then with the lesser root structures becomes much more problematic, I guess is a way to put it. All right. So what's the key here? Well, it comes back to that decomposition. See, one of the things about wetland environments, and as we said, so decomposition is on the loss side of this equation. But one of the really good thing about wetland environments is that because so much of their biomass is under the soils, a lot of the decomposition that occurs as the plants die off or tissue dies for whatever reason and it decomposes, it's already under the soils. Also, because those soils are very anoxic, or those sediments rather are very anoxic, that carbon itself decomposes very slowly. And there's a lot of opportunity for it to continue to work down in those soil/sediment horizons to a point where it's far less likely to be re-released back to the atmosphere. And as a consequence of that, that decomposition element is far reduced, if you'll pardon the pun, because wetlands are reductive environments. Anyway, it's far reduced, and so it gives wetlands a real advantage when we're talking about carbon sequestration, and that's part of why there's so much focus on this in these carbon markets. In class last time, we talked a little bit about, well, if you're putting it in the soils, isn't it just going to be dug up again? Well, when you think about it, the fossil fuels that we're using are essentially the remains of largely plants that were alive hundreds of thousands, even millions of years ago, right? And a lot of those were generated in wetland environments, okay? So the cycle for that is very, very long. And again, another reason why these blue carbon approaches we think are going to be very effective and have shown themselves to be so far. So the consensus in the sciences is that conserving large areas of these coastal wetlands with these different types of plants may help offset carbon emissions. Now, this, like everything, it depends. Okay, it depends on what the depend part is how effective it's going to be. I think we're all pretty well in agreement that these wetlands are very effective at this role, but how effective they are in terms of the scope of the whole problem is going to depend on what are future emissions, what's the stability of the wetland environments in which these plants are taking root, and what kinds of changes to the global environment overall are occurring that might change that balance somewhat. So we already talked about a little bit about how changes in temperature in the Arctic, this is true to a lesser extent in the Antarctic as well, are allowing volatile organic carbons back out into the atmosphere. So depending on how that plays out over the next, 50, 75 years, that, how effective this is going to be, is to be seen still. But in terms of the viability of these, the functions that these coastal wetlands provide in this area is really significant. Okay, so a couple of clicker questions here. So carbon fixation by plants removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This is true, right? Carbon dioxide is an organic form of carbon. This is, I'm sorry, carbon dioxide is an inorganic form of carbon. This is also true, right? There's no hydrogen attached to it, which is one of the clues that you would see if it were an organic form rather than an inorganic form. There are carbon pools in the atmosphere, the terrestrial plants, ocean, and marine sediments. So this is a little bit of a trick question because all of these things are true. You'll find carbon pools in each one of those things, okay? So if you got any of those wrong, go back and take another look at the material, look through the videos if you need, and let me know if you have any questions. All right, let's talk about the nitrogen cycle here a little bit. Nitrogen cycle is very interesting. It's also the most complicated of the nutrient cycles that we're going to focus on by some margin. There's a lot that has to happen here. By comparison, the carbon and phosphorus cycles are relatively straightforward. Nitrogen is very common in the environment. In fact, it makes up the bulk of the gases in the atmosphere. So the air you're breathing right now, for instance, is composed of about 78% nitrogen gas, so N2. So two nitrogen atoms that are hooked together in a very strong triple bond. So those two atoms don't want to come apart in that molecule very easily at all. And that means that organisms really can't utilize nitrogen in that form. So that nitrogen in the atmosphere is very stable. Those levels have been very stable for as long as we've been measuring them. And it needs to be converted if it's going to be used by living organisms, right? There needs to be some sort of conversion. So this can be, they can be converted, as we're going to see, into things like ammonium or, more importantly, nitrate, which is primarily used by plants. And that, again, has to happen if these organisms are going to have access to that nitrogen. And that's part of the issue, as we're going to see, in terms of availability of nitrogen. So organic nitrogen is the nitrogen that's typically in living organisms. And this can be in the form of proteins, waste products, and it's made out of an inorganic compound. So plants need to synthesize organic nitrogen from inorganic nitrogen compounds. Okay, so this creation of what we refer to as bioavailable, okay, so available to biologic organisms, the creation of bioavailable inorganic nitrogen forms from nitrogen gas does take energy on the part of specific organisms, which are fairly limited in terms of the types of different species that actually can perform this function. And it's rate limited, so it takes time also. And so you've got time and energy costs associated with this. And this, in turn, even though nitrogen is very abundant in the environment, it is still often considered a limiting nutrient, especially in some environments. And again, it's not because it's rare, it's because it's difficult to access. So let's look at that a little bit. The nitrogen cycle, again, is very complicated. You look at this overall, there's a lot of things happening here, right? But to distill this, okay, I want you to focus on where I've got these green dotted lines, right? So essentially, we need to get from nitrogen that's pooled in the atmosphere or maybe added to soils via fertilizers, we need to get from there to a process called mineralization. Okay. So this takes that inorganic nitrogen and turns it into organic nitrogen. And then from there, we need to get it fixed by microbes that will turn it into, through a process called nitrification, they'll turn it into nitrite, and then very quickly, they'll turn this into nitrate. And it's nitrate that is what plants uptake. That's the nutrient that they actually can use. And this is really important because remember, plants are the bottom of the food web, right? They're the base. They're the base of the pyramid, and they perform a lot of really critical functions. So they need that nitrogen in order to be able to do that. So this is kind of to take the busyness out of this. This is really the steps that have to be taken in order to get to where they need to go. Okay. Um, so you've got fixation. So you've got nitrogen being turned into typically ammonium, this NH4, and that really it's more successful in an anoxic environment. So wetland soils are particularly um, they're particularly beneficial in terms of this particular process, creating these inorganic forms of nitrogen into organic forms. So in wetland soils, a lot of times you'll see things like cyanobacteria that have these heterocysts that facilitate the fixation of nitrogen in this sense. And again, you don't want the oxygen in this environment isn't beneficial. The lack of oxygen is beneficial to getting it into this organic form. From there, then you start the process of nitrification, and this involves nitrifying bacteria, of which there are a variety of different forms. I'll talk about that here in a minute. But so this needs an oxic environment. You need to get to this, and essentially you need to get to nitrate, NO3, right? So you go NH4 very briefly, this NO2, which can be toxic to plant roots and in many environments. So you don't want it to build up very high. So that's a quick intermediate step to get to nitrate, which is the nutrient that the plants need, okay? Now, there are other things that can happen, like we talked about, and I'm going to go back to the other graphic here in a second, but denitrification is one of those things. So this converts nitrate back to nitrogen gas that diffuses back up into the atmosphere. That completes the cycle. Remember, a cycle is a big circle. All right. And this actually, again, benefits from an anoxic environment, low oxygen. Okay. Mineralization occurs when you're taking nitrogen, again, that organic nitrogen, and converting it into NH4. But there's another process called mineralization. We'll see here in a second where this can be taken up by plants or microbes, becomes part of their tissue, and then that is not then available for nitrification. Okay. So, and then there's also volatilization and leaching, and I'll touch base on those. So let's go back to this graphic, right? So we agreed we got to get from here to here to here to here, okay, is where we're headed to nitrates. So the problem is there's all of these places where nitrogen can be lost in this cycle. So it's not all about creating nitrogen. There's lost sections of it, which that's valuable when you're talking about a cycle where things have to go back, right? No, there's no, you're not destroying any matter here. We're just converting it and moving it around in the environment. So one of those places we talked about is immobilization. This is where plants or microbes actually utilize that nitrogen for their own processes. It becomes part of their tissue, at which point it's no longer available for this process of nitrification. Okay. Um, in some cases, volatilization can occur. So this ammonium that occurs during mineralization, so when we're converting organic nitrogen, that can be volatilized as ammonia gas back out to the atmosphere. In some cases, even if we get all the way to the nitrate stage, it doesn't all get pulled up by plants. In fact, some of that nitrate is extremely water soluble, and so it is very easily leached, especially in well-drained soils, so high permeability soils like we talked about last time. But also then there are some bacteria, denitrifying bacteria. So denitrifying bacteria are things like, there's some Micrococcus species, some Thiobacillus species, even things like Serratia, Pseudomonas, among others, that can then convert that nitrate to things like nitrous oxide or back to nitrogen gas. So there are areas where nitrogen is lost to the system. Some of them return it back to the atmosphere, some of it pool it down in groundwater or deep soils, right? So a lot happening here. In terms of nitrifying bacteria, again, there are quite a few of them. Nitrous simonis is one. Nitrosococcus is another one, Nitrobacter. So some of these you probably heard about. And again, there's a lot of, no matter what environment you're in, the bacteria that do this are relatively limited. I mean, there's quite a lot of them, but still they're relatively limited. When you look at the entire biosphere, it's a relatively few amount of organisms that can actually make this conversion work, right? All the way through the process. Now, wetlands, so I've been showing you an upland environment, but wetlands are really very similar. In fact, if you look at this, you can see it's really got all of the same steps here. The real difference with wetlands and the reason that they're so good at dealing with carbon in the last cycle we looked at is really the same reason that they can hold on to nitrogen and why they're so good at dealing with nitrogen. It has to do with the fact they have those anoxic environments that are beneficial to two different parts of the process. But the most important element is converting. So that process of mineralization, where we're going from organic carbon to ammonium, that needs an anoxic environment for that to occur. And consequently, you are going to benefit from the anoxic environments that wetlands work from. So, one of the interesting things is that nitrogen, the cycling, is greatly affected by how long that inundation occurs. So I have a supplemental video up on this where I can go into this in a little more detail. And I would encourage you to go take a look at that if this is something you feel like you need to review and look at a little more closely. And I can talk a little bit more in that about some of these differences between wetlands and uplands in this sense. But this is the basic of it, right? So when we're talking about key points here as they apply to these environments, denitrification, volatilization, immobilization, leaching. Those result in either permanent or temporary, depending on nitrogen losses from the soil. And the processes of fixation, mineralization, and nitrification increase nitrate, so the bioavailable nitrogen. Lots of these anaerobic microbial processes occur in these wetland soils, right? And so again, how much inundation there is can limit or extend how well and how fast this cycle occurs within these environments. All right, so Another quicker question. Which of the following processes can occur in oxic, in other words, where oxygen is present, environments? Well, that would be C, nitrification, right? Nitrification needs oxygen to occur because we're trying to get to nitrate, right? We're trying to get from ammonium to nitrate, all right? And you need that oxygen, three oxygen atoms on that nitrogen in order for that to occur. When you add organic fertilizer, such as manure, to a field, can the plants use the nitrogen in that fertilizer? And if not, what needs to happen to the organic nitrogen before plants can take up that nitrogen? Well, um, since they can only use inorganic forms, adding organic fertilizer doesn't directly benefit the plant. So you need these processes that we've talked about, right? You need these processes in order for that to occur. And the most important one here is mineralization, because that's what's taking the organic nitrogen and getting it into its inorganic form, which is primarily ammonia. Okay. All right. Okay. So let's move on to phosphorus. Again, this is a much simpler cycle overall than nitrogen is the complicated beast of the group of them because there's so many steps and things involved. All right, so phosphorus is also a limiting nutrient, and I would argue that in many environments, it is the most limiting nutrient for plants. So much more so than carbon, even more so than nitrogen, in spite of the fact that nitrogen has all these steps and energy components in order to convert it from a form that can't be used to one that can. The problem with phosphorus is that um, phosphorus is also not readily available because of where it's located. But it is very necessary because you'll find phosphorus is needed in a whole bunch of living matter, including nucleic acids, adenine triphosphate, so energy conversion in cells, phospholipids and cell membranes, all of those things need that phosphorus. So it is an important nutrient. Um, and that's the other thing. It doesn't actually really occur in its free form, right? So you don't really see it as free phosphorus. It's almost always it's always bound to something. I shouldn't say almost always. It's always bound to something. It is very, very highly reactive. All right, so generally you're going to find phosphorus in the form of phosphate, PO4, and it's generally going to be in rock form. So it's very much associated with rocks that are in that those lower horizons. And we'll take a look at that here in a couple of minutes. But in organisms, so you'll find phosphate excreted in urine. And it can combine because it's so reactive with a whole variety of other minerals. It's really hard to obtain inorganic phosphorus because it's in rocks and it's just not biologically accessible. Um, Consequently, it is a highly limiting nutrient. So here again, you should have seen this or some version of this at some point. And there is a kind of a separate phosphorus cycle that occurs in aquatic environments, but this is a minor cycle relative to the major cycle of phosphorus, which largely occurs as phosphorus is moved from rock out into the terrestrial environment and then eventually finds its way back into that rock. And because where the parent rock where this phosphorus is found is so deep down in the soils, it really doesn't come in contact with the surface all that much, right? So you don't find it in a gaseous form at all. You only find it in liquids and solids, right? And there aren't a whole lot of microbial interactions there. So there aren't really bacteria that are converting this or bringing it to the surface for us because the bacteria are largely up here in the surface area. So primarily in this O horizon and somewhat down into the A horizon. because that's where the oxygen is for the most part, and that's where most of the nutrients, the other nutrients and food that they need, that stuff is mostly up in that environment because there's so much organic material up there. So down here where I've circled, this is where you're going to find phosphorus, and it's mostly going to be down here in this C horizon. So you'll find it in the B horizon, and you will find plant roots that'll get down that deep. But by and large, it's out of reach of most living organisms, and consequently, the reactive phosphorus pool is very small. Really, phosphorus is produced into the environment by weathering of some sort. So that might be erosion, or by human activities. Mining in particular can release phosphorus into the environment. All right, so, so there's one other thing I want to tell you before we click off of this slide. Getting ahead of myself there. So phosphorus is what it has been really problematic in aquatic environments. As I said, it is the primary limiting nutrient in most aquatic environments. And when we've had problems with phosphorus, it's usually because of something. It's usually because of an anthropogenic impact, because otherwise it is not very bioavailable. And so one good example of this has to do with the Great Lakes in the 1970s, which had significant eutrophication and anoxic issues in those lakes. And that was largely because of the inputs of phosphorus through our wastewater. Detergents, up until, gosh, I want to say it was into the 90s before we really got this really corrected meaningfully. Detergents like laundry detergent, like dish detergents, many concentrated soaps had phosphorus in it because phosphorus is very reactive. So it makes an excellent cleaning agent. It wants to bind to stuff. And so there was phosphorus added to these detergents. And so when you do the wash cycle or you're washing your dishes or whatever you're doing, it's also very water soluble. So it would wash out with that drain water and it would go right through our water treatment systems, and out into our waterways, and it would find its way into these systems. And because it is a plant nutrient, plants in the water, so you can think phytoplankton, algae, all variety of aquatic plants, they would see this influx of this nutrient, and it's like going to the buffet, right? All of a sudden, you've got what typically is not very available, and actually would be the limiting nutrient. So it would be the thing that would stop your growth, even before nitrogen. Now, suddenly, we've got an excess of it. So now these plants could continue to reproduce and grow, and they could grow to the point that they exhausted the phosphorus and the nitrogen and essentially kind of overshot their carrying capacity for that environment. So as they started to die off, the bacteria would start to decompose the respiration process associated with the bacteria and other decomposers would then create these anoxic conditions in these waterways. So you'd have environments that were very much affected by this. And that has been greatly improved in today's environment. If you pay attention to your laundry detergent, for instance, you will see it says phosphorus free on it. And so that's it's good. Okay, I'm not saying it's not good. It's great, actually. But the marketing part of it kind of makes me chuckle because they're actually required to do that by law. So they're not doing you a favor out of the goodness of their heart there. They're required to do it, but they see an opportunity to say, hey, look at this great thing we're doing for the environment. That's good. It's fine. But nonetheless, it has had a really substantial impact. You can think about the anoxic zone, the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico off of the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River drains fully 1/3 of the continental United States. That is a lot of opportunity for nutrients, including phosphorus, to get out into that dead zone and cause many of the problems we see out there. Reduction of those, again, we tend to be the disruptors in these biogeochemical cycles. So awareness of these and understanding of how they work is really valuable in terms of solving these problems, right? Or addressing other issues in these aquatic environments. Okay. So quick clicker question, not a click quicker question. So which of the following is a true statement? Carbon is a limiting nutrient because it is rare. Nitrogen is not a limiting nutrient because it is abundant in the environment. Phosphorus is a limiting nutrient because it is in inorganic forms that are bound to rocks and are not biologically accessible, or more than one of these statements is true. Well, if you answered C, you are correct. Carbon is very abundant in the environment, and nitrogen is not a limiting, it is in fact a limiting nutrient because of the conversion process that's required to get it into its bioavailable forms. Okay. So with that, you should be able to do things like identify key characteristics of these wetland soils and describe how to measure them. You should be able to summarize in general the major global nutrient cycles that we've talked about, and also describe the role of wetlands in those nutrient cycles. So if you have any questions or would like to discuss any of this further, please do reach out to me. You know how to get in contact with me, and I'm more than happy to share my time with you. So please let me know, and I will look forward to seeing you next time.